In the race for City Hall tonight, moving day in two big races as we reach nail-biting time for the candidates. We're now just 12 days away from the primary, and on the Democratic side of the mayoral race, the three-way battle between de Blasio, Thompson, and Quinn may be morphing into a front-runner and two chasers. Quinnipiac with Bill de Blasio now way out in front at 36%. If he gets to 40% on primary day, he would avoid a runoff, something that nobody thought was possible even a couple of weeks ago. Christine Quinn is at 21, Thompson at 20. Everyone else is essentially dead in the water. The other polling shocker from Quinnipiac is in the Comptroller's race, where Scott Stringer has bridged a 19-point gap just 2 weeks ago and is now tied with Elliot Spitzer 46-46. For insight on both races, we turn to Jill Colvin, senior political reporter at the New York Observer. We spoke earlier this afternoon. Jill, let's start with that Q poll and the big 15-point lead for Bill de Blasio. We'll get a better sense tomorrow with the Times poll as to whether that's an outlier. But, you know, Bill Thompson and Christine Quinn have been attacking de Blasio and not each other, which to my mind makes me think that's a legitimate lead. What's your sense on where the race stands?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the way that both Bill Thompson and Christine Quinn have been pummeling Bill de Blasio for the past couple weeks, it indicates that their internal polls are really saying the same thing, that Bill de Blasio has now somehow just sprinted ahead and is now clearly the front runner in this race. How
has he gotten that far ahead that quickly? Is it stop and frisk, the hospital closures, the fact that he's gotten the label as the progressive candidate, the Dante ad? What's your take?
I mean, it's really been quite an incredible rise. And I think it's a number of factors that have all sort of lined up in a way that was very fortuitous for him. The ad is being credited. This is probably the most successful ad of the campaign so far. It's an ad that features his son speaking to the camera, talking about his father. That clearly resonated across the city, especially among black voters who really identified with this young kid talking about stop and frisk. That also coincided with some very good luck for him. You had the federal court ruling on stop and frisk, which suddenly thrust that issue right into the spotlight. And as he wound up being sort of on the right side of the issue, he's painted himself as the most aggressively anti-stop and frisk candidate.
That's also something that we're seeing reflected in some of the numbers that are broken down in the Q poll. Among black voters, Quinnipiac gives de Blasio a 9-point lead over Bill Thompson. Is that positive engineering from the de Blasio campaign, or more of a failure for Bill Thompson to connect with a voting bloc that really should be his?
Yeah, I mean, it's really incredible. He's leading among, Chris Quinn among women, well ahead of Bill Thompson. Now, Bill Thompson's campaign has been very reticent about poll numbers throughout. They say that there is a history in New York City of these polls consistently underrepresenting the black vote for black candidates, say that their voters are going to be late deciders who are going to break for him at the very end. But you really do hear it when you talk to voters in black neighborhoods that there seems to be a disconnect with Thompson, and they're kind of excited by Bill de Blasio. Another interesting thing to note in that poll also was they asked these likely primary voters how they felt about how the city was going and whether they wanted a change from the way Mayor Michael Bloomberg has been running the city. And among those voters, Bill de Blasio has done extremely well, kind of tapping into that frustration over the Bloomberg years that Bill Thompson hasn't as effectively been able to do.
As you mentioned, both Thompson and Quinn have been going after de Blasio for the last couple of weeks. We should expect them to open up with both barrels at this point going forward. Where do you think de Blasio might be weak to attacks from both Quinn and Thompson?
Well, Christine Quinn has really zeroed in on this flip-flopping, talking from both sides of his mouth sort of narrative, and something that seems to resonate very well. I was at an anti-Christine Quinn rally last night where there were a whole bunch of Bill de Blasio supporters, and they kept hitting Christine Quinn over term limits. And I mentioned to them, well, the Quinn campaign keeps bringing up the fact that back in 2005, when Bill de Blasio was interested in running for speaker, he also had supported overturning term limits legislatively. That really seemed to surprise a number of his kind of folks who've just decided to support him, made them say they were going to go back and look at that. It didn't sit quite right with them. So I think that is going to be an issue that we're going to see both the Thompson and the Quinn campaigns hitting him on. Today they were bringing up some issues about transparency, some lobbyist meetings that he held in the public advocate's office. I think they're just going to be digging through as much Oppo research as they can find to throw throw anything that they can at him.
Trying to bring his numbers down, and if the Quinnipiac numbers are right, he's only 4 points away from avoiding a runoff, so it should be a very interesting last 2 weeks. Want to ask you quickly, Jill, about the Comptroller's race. The Q poll out today has a flat-footed tie between Spitzer and Stringer. You think this is a drop for, is Spitzer sort of losing support? Has Stringer gained support? What do you think accounts for it's a 19-point movement in 2 weeks?
Oh yeah, and what's really incredible is if you break down and you look at some of the crosstabs among black voters. I mean, Stringer has managed to nearly double his support from low 20s to 40%. And that was really the group that had pushed Eliot Spitzer up. He was extremely, extremely popular among African-American voters, among Latino voters, and Scott Stringer seems to very effectively, through campaigning in minority neighborhoods, a whole host of very prominent endorsements, really seems to be cutting into that lead. Also, another factor is that, I mean, Scott Stringer has recently really emerged on television. At the beginning, it was only Eliot who had ad after ad after ad, and it looks like that those ads are now starting to resonate with voters. We'll see. I mean, there's still 2 weeks left, and it's possible that Eliot could, wind up regaining some of that ground.
All right, so that interview with Jill Colvin of the New York Observer earlier this afternoon. I want to bring in our panel now. Dominic, I'm curious, 36%, if this is accurate, we'll find out tomorrow. The Times has another poll coming out. We'll see if this is an outlier. But 36%, I started doing a little math in my head. If Al Sharpton comes out and endorses Bill de Blasio, this thing could be over.
Yes, but I just don't see that happening. The Sharpton endorsement is still out there. He's tight, that is, he being Sharpton with Bill Thompson and with de Blasio. So who knows what Reverend Sharpton is going to do. He may decide to sit this one out. And not because the pressure is going to be on Sharpton. He can tip this race one way or the other. I don't know if de Blasio holds up. I've been describing this as now he's the front runner. Quinn went through this, that big bullseye on his back. A lot of people don't know that he's flip-flopped on term limits. You bet your life on it, Andrew. Those commercials will be up and running from Thompson and from Quinn, pointing out that Bill de Blasio has flip-flopped on term limits.
But de Blasio's been more or less the front runner for the last couple of weeks, or
at least two
right,
weeks, give or take.
And certainly in the debates, everybody's focused on him. He's held up pretty well with the bullseye on his back so far. In fact, he's expanded his lead, if you believe the numbers.
Well, it's really only been 1 or 2 debates that he's held up, and they didn't really go after him. But you could tell from those debate performances, frankly, that Quinn and Thompson don't really like de Blasio, and they're almost teaming up, if you will. Here's what I will say as of right now. If you believe the polls, the odd man out is Christine Quinn. Because you can bet on it, Thompson is underpolling. Blacks historically don't show up as well in polls, and so you got to bump up his numbers at least 5 or 6%. And so that means that if these numbers hold up, that means de Blasio and Thompson in a runoff. And anything can happen in a runoff. This race is starting to remind me of Fernando Ferrer and Mark Green all over again.
Don't Thompson and Quinn have to sort of turn on each other at some point to make sure, so that they can each make sure that they come in second and get to the runoff?
Excellent question. You got to shoot for the top dog, and at the same time, you're scrapping to just hang in there. That's exactly the point. And so it's strategy. Do you go after de Blasio? Do you risk turning off primary voters? Because really, there's no difference in their positions on stop and frisk. Quinn is a little bit more moderate. Thompson's a little more moderate, but as his ad, as he put up, there's really not much of a difference. It's just that de Blasio has been able to play into the perception that he is the one. It's amazing. It really is amazing. Fernando Ferrer ran on a tale of 2 cities. Exact campaign that de Blasio did. Yeah. It flopped for Fernando Ferrer. He almost became a Democratic nominee, but ultimately it didn't happen. Then de Blasio comes along. It seems to work for him. I guess the stars are just aligned for him right now.
Mr. Chairman, we've had a lot of Republicans come on this show and say if they had to pick anybody of the Democratic field, not named Weiner or Lou, I guess, that they want to see the Republicans run against, it would be de Blasio. Are Democrats doing Republicans a favor here?
They could be, and I think Dominic is right that Quinn is going to be the odd person out here for 2 reasons. One, she's never run a citywide campaign. The other 2 have. Secondly, she's a legislator. As a legislator, you get very compromised on a lot of things. Third, she's very closely aligned with Mayor Bloomberg. And so she gets stuck in the position, Ray Kelly's going to be my police commissioner, but I don't want stop and frisk. I support shielding the city. And that's an impossible position to be in. The other two exude leadership because they are actually, they are in positions, whether you're a public advocate or controller, you're running your own show, and it's a separate kind of thing. So I think that's where it ends up. The Republicans, de Blasio started on the left, Tale of Two Cities. On the other hand, his programs were ones that people know will not happen. And he's talking to business, I'll help business, et cetera, et cetera. He did not say I'm going to raise property taxes, which he could do unilaterally, or I mean, he could do within the city in order to fund pre-K. I'm going to raise income taxes where you need approval from Albany. People criticize him for that. On the other hand, people will say, well, maybe while he looks like he's on the left, he's really more centrist than he is. But as a person who looks like the far left candidate, if he is the Mark Green, we'd be very happy to run against him, as we were against Mark Green.
Let me just make this point. When there was a novice candidate, nobody thought he could win, and I said, people thought that, you know, I was drinking some type of weird drink, and I said, don't sleep on this guy, he could win. And I was ridiculed, and the guy's name happened to be Mike Bloomberg. I'm going to say it again. Don't think that this race is over once the Democrats get their candidate. Casamatides and also Joe Lota, don't sleep on these guys, the Republican candidates. It takes one incident in the city where the tide can completely turn, or the Democrats may stumble and boom. This race, I know Republicans have held City Hall for the last, 20 years in New York City. This race is not a cakewalk for Democrats. Don't assume that the Democratic nominee is the next mayor of New York City.
And yeah.
Now through October 1, and the Democrats are going to be trying to preach to the base of the Democratic Party, which is far left. That does not represent the general electorate, which we as Republicans
Agree,
are
Mr.
talking
Chair,
to.
because as soon as the primary is over, primary night, the nominee is going to start going like this, pulling back. I'm pulling back from the left, and I'm going now to the middle to try and appeal to all New Yorkers.
But this time it's a very late primary because of the problems with voting machines.
Agreed.
It's
And
an
if there's a
October
runoff,
1 primary.
if there's a runoff, that's 2 more weeks.
Right.
All right, interesting. Going to be an interesting last couple of weeks,
Yes.
certainly. Much more on this to come on this edition of RFL. After the break, dollar meals not paying for Happy Meals, if you will. Fast food workers in New York and across the country off the job again today, hoping to turn minimum wage into a living wage. We're going to debate that next. Stay with us.